Good afternoon. My name is Slav Trunekov, and I've been invited by Yene, by Mr. Stambolis, to moderate this session of ours. We have a substantial number of speakers, but most of them are in fact online. So please don't be misled by the fact that it's only three of us here in front. The topic of our session is related again to issues which we already heard about during the first half of the day, related to what is going on in the world and in Europe, and also in Southeastern Europe in particular, about the changes in the energy field, which are a lot, and along with the changes, it's a lot of challenges which come ahead. And within this year in particular, these changes and challenges kind of got completely different dimension. I was very impressed to listen to the previous speakers who brought, from their perspective, a set of optimism, a set of realism. There were some statements which sounded a little bit overly enthusiastic, as the one, for example, for me, this is my assessment, of the representative of the European Commission. But anyhow, this is what these conferences are about, to listen to different views and to make the best of the fact that we are together. And let me once again thank Mr. Stambolis and Yene about bringing us together. If you recall the statement of the Secretary General of the Greek Ministry of Energy, she said that Mr. Stambolis and Yene represent a school of energy. I would say they are a source of energy as well. And I'm very grateful for this support of theirs for bringing us together. Now, a few words about the procedures of the panel. As I said, we shall have a lot of speakers online. We shall have also some time, I hope, for questions and debate, because during such kind of events, the debate with the audience, that is with all of you, is of particular importance. And I've asked in advance our speakers to be very mobilized, very concise to the point, so we have sufficient time for this debate. Let me tell you that Professor Pantelis Kapros, who is on the list of the speakers, apologized himself. He will not be able to participate due to some personal reasons, but the rest of the speakers are here. There was already a reference to statistics, which was provided also from different point of views. We heard the chair of the Greek regulatory authority. We heard the ministers. Now it is time to get a kind of a much broader statistical look. And we are very privileged to have with us, although online, a representative of the International Energy Agency in Paris, who will bring to us details of the recently published, it is literally less than 1 month old, World Energy Outlook, which is one of the most profound statistical documents in the world. And with these words, I'm very privileged now to give the floor to Mr. Apostolos Petropoulos from the International Energy Agency in Paris, who is going to be with us. Oh, you're here?
Yeah.
Oh, I thought, you surprised me.
Quickly, but
Yeah. Well, very nice. Even better.
yeah.
You're going to speak in Greek or in...
I will start in Greek and I will shift in English.
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much.
Καλησπέρα σας. Ονομάζομαι Απόστολος Πετρόπουλος. Θα ήθελα να ευχαριστήσω τον κύριο Σταμπολή και το ΙΕΝΕ για την πρόσκληση να συμμετέχουμε σε αυτό το συνέδριο. So, I will shift to English in order to facilitate also the discussion with other panelists here. So today I will give you an overview about the key findings of World Energy Outlook 2022. And let's start with what we are experiencing today. So what we are seeing in the energy markets, it's a big energy shock. And in terms of complexity and also tendency of what we have seen, it's larger and more rapid compared to what we have seen back to 70s, because it doesn't affect only oil. It affects mainly gas, oil. There was also a tightness there in the market, and as a consequence also of the gas, there is also a big spike on electricity prices. What is important to highlight here is that, as we see in the figure, that almost 100% of the countries, they have recorded inflation ratio that are over 6%. And we see how bonded and how embedded it is, like the energy sector with the economy. Of course, this crisis is going to affect the most vulnerable ones. We see, for example, we have assessed that in 2022, we expect 75 million of people that they gain access to electricity, and 100 million at a global scale that they gained access to clean cooking. They are going to lose their ability to pay their bills. This is something that we would like to highlight from our analysis. And what currently we did in the World Energy Outlook, we tried to answer the question about, is that this crisis, it will be like a catalyst in order to move forward on clean energy transition, or it's going to add additional barriers on that. And as you see from the picture here, this is the investments we had on clean energy technologies. It's nuclear, it's renewables, it's grids, storage, it's all the combination of different technologies out there. And as you see, since 2015, after the Paris Agreement, we see more or less a plateau on investments there. And this is uptick in 2021. We do expect to they reach already $1.3 trillion at global scale. And if we take on board all the different announcements across the globe, for example, we had recently the announcement from United States, the Inflation Reduction Act, the announcements from the European Union, the packages from Japan and China, we do expect in a reference scenario these investments to surpass 2 trillion. So this is a 50% increase compared to today's level. However, we need, in order to be aligned with a scenario on 1.5 degrees, this to reach even further and to almost double that, to go to 4 trillion in order to respect carbon neutrality by 2050. Let's move a little bit on the electricity sector and electricity generation. So what we do expect to happen this year? Of course, due to the situation in the markets, for example, we had already from the previous speakers heard about the turbulence on gas market and the role of Russia there. We do expect a slight increase on coal-fired plants generation. And this is a response about energy security, plus the impact on prices that we see. And the growth is coming mainly from Europe, but also for Asia, because in Asia we have also an increase in general on electricity demand. But in terms of key question, if this is going to stay long, this is the answer. In our reference scenario, which is a scenario that takes on board all the policies that are already stated in law, we don't expect to last long, this shift to coal. And of course, from the figure, you see that the clear winner is renewable. And this is a situation in the coming years. And this is what we do expect by 2030. This is a global picture. Even further penetration of renewables is, of course, in the case of the EU, because the really ambitious targets that we put forward. And just to point out here that 90%, the renewables are going to increase by 90%. And this is the implication on CO2 emissions. So we do estimate that already today, a peak on power sector CO2 emissions happened. And this is a disaggregation for advanced and emerging and developing economies. Already advanced economies are going to continue the decline on CO2 emissions. This is a power sector carbon emissions there. And we do see a peak, it's happening, it's happened already in emerging market and developing countries. However, an additional ambitious and more faster decarbonization of the power sector is needed if we want to respect 1.5 degree scenario. Just to clarify, this scenario is 2.5 degrees, so it's further away our climate targets. So let's look a little bit if, in terms of production and capacity that we need in terms of for the new technologies, it's out there. So in the figure, with the green line there, we see what is needed in order to ensure a carbon neutrality by 2050, and this is like the level that we need by 2030. What about the plans that are already in place? This is a shares on key technologies like solar, battery, electrolyzers, lithium, in terms of what we need to be done in 2030 in order to ensure carbon neutrality by 2050. This is what we currently have, and this is what are the projects already in pipeline. Just to clarify here, what we have seen is that it's changed really quickly, the commitments from companies. For example, already from the Inflation Reduction Act package in the United States, more and more companies, they came in order to announce domestic production of batteries in the United States. So this is our current assessment. Of course, it depends, and it's up to the governments to make sure that these targets and these announcements from the companies are going to be materialized and to be ready by 2030. Another point we need to highlight is diversification of supply. Currently, like 3/3 of the battery production, it's located in China. So we need governments to have a close look on that in order to invest to produce domestically the batteries. And we see, for example, for solar capacities out there, we lag a little bit in terms of batteries and electrolyzers, and we need to push even further under this for meeting the climate goals. Another point that already previous speakers, they touched upon that, it's about what about the gas demand, what is happening there. So back to 2010, we questioned ourselves if we are entering a golden age of gas period, and this was our projection back to 2010, and we're pretty aligned with what happened today. Like, we see an exponential growth on natural gas demand. We saw that gas, it was a key fuel also for power sector. It became a key fuel and supplied all the additional industrial production there across the globe. However, the key point is where we are heading. And this is our projection in our reference scenario. We see a 5% growth by 2030 on gas, but then there is a plateau. Why we see a plateau there? This is like the part of the picture. We see advanced economies due to policies and the security issues to have a declining role on the gas consumption, and emerging market developing economies, they increase there due to the economic prosperity, due to that, like the increase in population there. However, what we have assessed and analyzed, we show that gas, it's hard to compete like to renewables. For example, in the power sector, renewables are becoming really, for example, solar, really competitive in terms of like levelized cost there. Plus, there are some turbulence in the markets that they lead on this situation. And this on the right side, we see the structural change in terms of trade globally. I mean, we know already about Russian invasion and what is the implication there on the global trading. And we see that there is a structural shift from the usage of pipelines to LNG. Another point that we identified from the analysis is that the first time that in our projection we see a peak to happening in fossil fuel demand. Historically, we see an exponential growth of fossil fuel demand. We see that this is really goes hand by hand with what we saw in terms of after industrialization processes across the globe. And more or less in the last decades, already Mr. Staboulis mentioned that 80% of the total energy supply, it was coming from oil, coal, and gas, from fossil fuels. In our projections, in the reference scenario, this 80% is going to be 50% by 2050. We see a drop there, and the peak is happening before 2030. Thanks to the policies, for example, natural gas, we see a plateau, as I mentioned previously. Coal is going to peak in the coming years, and oil is going to peak at mid-30s. And just to zoom in a little bit on oil peak and to talk about electric cars. So 5 years ago, I think that nobody was believing a lot on the transition on electromobility, that what was happening there. And if you see from the figure like today, we are heading for 13% market share of electric cars globally. Just to give you an example, 1 out of 4 cars that sold globally are electric in China. In Europe, it's 1 out of 5, and in the United States, it's close to 7% in 2022. Just in 1 month, in September, we sold globally 1 million electric cars, just in 1 month, and this is equivalent to the Spanish car market. This is how we do expect to move forward in our projection, and this is a scenario that we call it an announced pledge scenario. This is a scenario of 1.7 degrees, and it takes on board not only the laws, the policies that are already in law. We take into account also the NDC targets and the climate targets for carbon neutrality. For example, US has a target, Europe has a target, ensuring carbon neutrality by 2050. And this is a picture there. We do expect at global level 1 out of 3 cars to be electric. And for key markets like US, EU, and China, 1 out of 2 cars will be electric. We see like that this is not linked about only to the fact that more OEMs, more automakers, they announce electromobility plans. There is also linked to the fact that electromobility addresses air pollution issue, plus we cut the reliance on oil imports. Talking a little bit about the role of Russia. So Russia today is by far the biggest, the largest exporter of fossil fuels. It's 50% higher, the oil and gas that they export versus the second one, the Saudi Arabia. And this was the outlook that we had last year. And this is what we expect to happen in the oil markets, especially after the ban that it has been announced from the EU. And this is what is happening now in terms of gas markets after the situation and the ban from the EU. So in our outlook, in the reference scenario, we do expect that the Russian share on global oil and gas trade is going to be half by 2030. And even if we see a short term, like here, that like Russia, for example, increased by $150 billion their revenues last year compared to what was happening 1 year before. However, at long term, we do expect by 2030 cumulatively to lose $1 trillion from this situation. It's harder for them to find alternative markets. First of all, because we don't see a big growth on gas demand coming from China. Plus, like they have less access to capital due to a lot of companies they moved away from there. And also there is a technological issue there because in order to explore and to increase the whales they have on Arctic and other places, they had quite a big presence there from Western companies to do that. So already we talk about energy security and what it's important here. So here it's in terms of investments. And as I explained you before, like 80% of the total system runs on fossil fuels. And currently, for each dollar that we invest on fossil fuel, we have 1.5 times higher investment on clean energy. And we have 2 systems there, and we would like to move forward from fossil fuels to clean energy technologies there. And this is how the balance needs to look like in a scenario which is 1.5 degrees. So for each dollar that we invest on fossil fuel, we need 9 times more to have on clean energy transition. This is our assessment about what balance we need to reach in order to meet the climate goals there at a global level. And in order to avoid having volatility on prices, this is what is needed to happen. It's not possible to not to invest at such level on clean energy technologies, on renewables, and to ensure that you will not have price spikes coming from the fossil fuel market. Another point that I would like to highlight highlight, it's about, especially for investments that we see on emerging and developing economies. What we have assessed is that the cost of capital for investing and building a solar PV is 2 to 3 times higher versus what is happening on the advanced economies and in China. For example, if you go to install a solar park in Africa or other regions, it's 2-3 points higher compared to what you have on advanced economies. Another issue that we analyze and where we talk a lot about, the key question here is that, okay, we have a system and Europe was really relying on gas markets from Russia. What about to shift to electromobility and other technologies that we need raw materials there? And this is a distribution that we see that, for example, for the 2 or 3 producers, there is really concentrated for lithium, cobalt, nickel, and rare earths. They account for over 3/4 of the global production. So the key point here is that governments need to identify this issue, to recognize that, and to diversify the supply. For example, to invest to produce domestically batteries, to enhance domestic exploration of resources. For example, we heard in the EU recently that there was new resources from lithium there. So, and just to talk a bit about the CO2 emission trends and to combine everything together, this was the outlook before Paris Agreement. This scenario is going to lead us to 3.5 degrees increase versus the pre-industrial levels by 2050. And this is what we managed to save. It's 1 degree less. It's 2.5 degree scenario, thanks to the policy response after the Paris Agreement, plus the development that you have from the cost reduction of renewables and clean energy technologies. This is what we assess is happening in the announced pledge scenario if we take on board all the different climate targets announced from countries and also different initiatives from companies. And this is what we are heading for in order to ensure that we have 1.5 degrees scenario out there. We need a structural shift to clean energy technologies, to renewables, to electric vehicles, and especially the challenging part is by 2030, because a lot of technologies that we need beyond 2030, it's really premature there. We are talking about advanced batteries, we are talking about to synthetic fuels, hydrogen, that you need already to start investing from now in order to ensure that beyond 2030 these technologies are available. And some conclusions from our side is that, okay, what we are experiencing now, it's really a big turbulence and energy crisis. However, we see a positive outcome of that and action from governments like the United States that they announced recently the Inflation Reduction Act. Of course, the Russian invasion is going to lead to a new role for Russia. Russia has lost the biggest market there in terms of gas and also oil. What about fossil fuels? As I mentioned before, we see a decoupling versus what we have seen on the GDP growth and the share on the market. And this is a positive part of the story there, even in a reference scenario. However, we need, in order to ensure that we keep open the door to 1.5 degrees scenario, to invest heavily on renewables and on EVs, and also, of course, on energy efficiency. This is from my side. Happy to take any questions if you have.
Well, thank you very much. It was really amazing. We shall certainly have questions. I just want to make comments, but I would propose that we leave all the questions at the end. But let me just say a few words. Certainly the picture which the IEA provides as usual is outstandingly good and outstandingly well illustrated. And I think that we should recall in this context, on the ground of what is said, one of the key messages which the Greek minister passed during the meetings of the ministers here. What he said was that the green transition is not contradictory to the energy security. On the contrary, it's the complementary element to it. And following what you presented, I think it will be the leading element for the energy security on a world basis. Certainly, the devil as usual is into the details, And just to provoke your attention in this context, I will tell you a few things about my country currently. Bulgaria now is exporting coal, something which we have not had as a situation for decades, and it exports coal to Serbia. And we rely 45 to 60% on the coal and about 40% to nuclear. And both these elements, if you put them in the overall European strategic goals, are should be left behind in a while. So we have to very carefully distinguish the current realities from what is upcoming. You also touched a very important issue, and I think that we should have particular time to debate on that, is the topic on energy poverty. And I will give you again an illustration with my country because I feel more comfortable with that. Currently we have a population of about 6.5 million people, and according to the latest assessments, we have more than 300,000 households, 300,000 families which are considered energy poor. But as we have not introduced still the definition of energy poverty, according to the latest calculations, the number should go well beyond this figure. So it's a very important topic we have to deal with. And the last point which I want to make, and thus giving the floor to our next speaker, is about the relations with Russia. In fact, our next speaker, who is the director of the Oxford Energy Institute, will talk particularly about the implications of the Russian-Ukrainian war on the energy security. But let me just tell you what I think in this aspect. It is a very important focus, but we should recall that the energy crisis did not start with the war between Russia and Ukraine. It was, in fact, well before that. So it kind of contributed, kind of stimulated the boom of technologies and the green energy and so on. But we have to also to look at the primary source of the situation as well. So thank you very much for your intervention. Please stay with us for the end of the panel. Now, I hope that we have contact with Dr. Bassam Fatou online. Dr. Fatou, can you hear us? His topic and has a presentation on that is related exactly to the Russian-Ukrainian war and its impetus on the energy security. Dr. Fatou? No? No. Well, in that case, please try to establish the contact with him. We shall go to our next speaker, who is also online, Tim Yeo. Is he available? Yes. Hi, Tim.
Hi.
Very nice seeing you.
You too.
How's the weather in London?
It's not too bad. Probably not as warm as it is with you, but it's fine today. We've had a remarkably mild autumn, actually.
Okay. Well, it's very nice to hear that. But in fact, we shall talk now about the energy situation in Europe and globally. And you represent a body which focuses particularly on the role of nuclear. And if you look at the strategic papers, at least at the EU level, one can note ups and downs, if I may say so, as an attitude towards nuclear, which, by the way, does not sound like Mozart in Austria or like Mikis Theodorakis in Greece. But at the same time, let me recall on the regional basis that for example, Turkey recently announced that they will start looking very concretely forward to another nuclear power plant in Sinop. And they have a third plan, which is a theory, which is somewhat 50 kilometers away from the Bulgarian border in a place called Ineada. It's theoretical for the time being. But what I mean, nuclear is not only kind of being considered, but I gave the example with Bulgaria about its role in the energy security, and it's not only in Bulgaria. So what is Your view on that?
Well, thank you very much, Savcho. I'm delighted to be taking part in the conference. And just to pick up on the point you've mentioned, I think in the last year and a half or so, the attitude of the European Commission towards nuclear has changed quite a lot. It used to be very sceptical, even hostile to nuclear. But the report they published last year, a research report, acknowledged the merits of nuclear, the fact that it is neither a risk to health nor to the environment. And that was a milestone, really. Before I develop that point, I'd just like to congratulate Kostis Stambolis on organising this conference again. It is a landmark event at this time of year, and it's a pleasure to take part. And I want to congratulate him and his team at IENE. They produced an excellent background paper yesterday, which I hope other people have seen. It set out very clearly the short and long-term challenges which the energy industry faces. And I'm going to focus in a moment on the longer term with particular reference to climate change. But I'd also just like to say how much I agree with Savcho that the energy crisis, which is now a very serious one, didn't start with Putin's invasion of Ukraine. We've been heading for this for a long time. There's been complacency in much of Western Europe about the extent to which we can safely rely on imported energy, and particularly, of course, imported Russian gas. And I think we had a rude shock, or many people had a rude shock at the start of this year when it became apparent that wasn't actually the case. I also agree with Savcho that energy poverty is now a real problem. It certainly is in my country, in the UK, and it needs to be addressed. And I'll have a word about that later on. I think it's fair to say that energy crisis is perhaps the most serious we've faced for quite a number of years. Electricity prices have soared, gas supplies are threatened, the risk of climate change becoming irreversible continues to grow. And on that last point, 3 days ago, COP27 ended in almost total failure. Although the rich, high-emitting nations have finally accepted the concept of loss and damage, no steps were taken at this COP to build on last year's commitment to phase down coal. No steps were taken at this COP to speed up cuts in CO2 emissions, and no steps were taken to set tougher emissions reduction targets. And I find that astonishing at the end of the year in which temperatures in many places rose so high that normal human life became impossible. This week, the fossil fuel companies are laughing all the way back. They are the real winners of COP27, while the rest of the world just let them off the hook. A few weeks ago, Turkey and Libya signed a new agreement to explore for oil and gas in the Mediterranean. But the truth is the world cannot safely consume all the existing reserves of oil and gas. So starting to look for more seems like folly. And any government which allows these exploration costs to be tax deductible against energy company profits is guilty of deliberately making climate change worse and bringing forward the day when it becomes uncomfortable for humanity. In the last 9 months, the risk of power outages caused by gas shortages has made security of energy supply the top priority for governments all around the world. And that's closely followed by fears about high energy prices, leaving the third element of the energy trilemma, sustainability, at the bottom of the agenda. Governments have reacted to the energy crisis by trying to appease voters and consumers with short-term measures, such as energy price subsidies. In the medium term, these will actually make things worse. And as the background paper points out, the cheapest, safest, and cleanest way to reduce reliance on fossil fuel imports from Russia is to improve energy efficiency and cut energy demand. Subsidizing energy prices does exactly the opposite. Governments should allow higher prices to drive more efficient use of energy. The European Union should maintain a low cap on emissions in the emissions trading system in order to force the carbon price up and thereby boost investment in low carbon technology of all kinds, not just in the energy, but in other industries as well. The right way to protect poor people and to defend them against energy poverty is to do that through welfare policy, not through price subsidies for fossil fuels.
Yeah.
In Southern Europe, gas and even coal still have a big part to play in the energy mix, but now is the right time to speed up the clean energy transition. More investment in all kinds of low carbon electricity generation technologies will improve energy security as well as cutting greenhouse gas emissions. And it will also stabilize prices, because Putin can't prevent the wind from blowing or the sun from shining. He can't drive up the price of wind or solar energy. Renewables are a secure energy source whose cost is largely under the control of the countries where it's used. And expanding renewables can enable the EU to end its dependence on Russian fossil fuels, possibly as soon as 2027. But intermittent renewables like solar and wind can never be the complete answer. The only reliable low carbon source of backup power and of baseload power is nuclear. And it's also a secure source because the fuel it needs is available from a wide range of geographically and other diverse suppliers. Once a nuclear reactor is up and running, the price of the electricity it generates is not subject to sudden spikes because of the cost of the fuel it uses is such a small proportion of the total cost. The International Energy Agency has shown that reaching net zero will be more expensive and more difficult without investment in nuclear capacity.
Okay.
In Europe, 11 countries are now considering, planning or starting nuclear power programs. And those that go ahead may enjoy a buyer's market because nuclear vendors around the world are competing for customers, so buyers can often negotiate attractive finance packages. And furthermore, soon we'll have small and advanced modular reactors coming on the market to bring nuclear power to places which haven't previously accessed it. So, in conclusion, the background paper from IENI makes clear that transitioning away from coal isn't easy. The UK's switch from heavy dependence on coal after World War II required huge government intervention to protect the communities affected. But in the face of worsening climate change, it's very hard to see how coal can remain a big part of Europe's energy mix for much longer. And my conclusion, therefore, is that completing the clean energy transition is the best way for Europe to strengthen energy security, to cut energy prices, and to prevent the human species from being destroyed by climate change. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tim. I just want to underline the fact that this, if I may say so, conflict between the views about the role of the baseload capacities versus the renewables in the different forms this is an issue which has to definitely find a clear answer, because what we saw in the projections of the IEA is definitely a huge boom of renewables, something which we also see. But this issue, maybe it's linked to technologies, maybe it's linked to policy, has to find its clear answer. The other issue which I just want to mention, which is not so much a strategic perspective, which you touched upon, is about the role of the government's intervention when it comes to the markets and when it comes to the support of the vulnerable people. I would say also to the business. What we face now is that governments, in practical terms, put additional taxation on companies which are profitable, and then they redistribute it via the social policy or via the policy related to the support of the business. And sometimes this also looks on the edge of reasonability, I would say. And we heard also here the ministers that, for example, when it came to the issue of the price of the gas price cap, there are different views. Europe is kind of split. So this is another issue which has to find a clear answer in more strategic perspective. So thank you very much. Please stay tuned. Of course, I'm very much supportive of nuclear, like you, but it's not something which everybody shares. So I will leave it to the audience afterwards, maybe to argue with you on what is said. May I ask now whether we have a contact with Dr. Fatouh from the Oxford University? No, not yet. Well, huh? Okay, then it's your turn. Then Now, according to the program, it's Dr. Leo Drolas.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes, hello.
Hello.
Dr. Drolas, you're also, I understand, from London. So I'm not going to ask you about the weather, like I did with Tim. Please give us your perspective. What, in your view, are the kind of the biggest operational and strategic challenges which we face these days when it comes to the issue of energy security and the role of the green transition?
Well, energy security, and in this case, we need to concentrate on the electricity business because that's where the crisis is occurring. In order to have security in electricity generation, an old way of doing so is by having a variety of sources of fuels in order to supply this security. And if you concentrate on just one fuel, then you are asking for trouble, or even two fuels. The trouble with renewable energy, used especially in power generation, is unfortunately the point that my previous speakers didn't quite address, is the intermittency of wind and of course solar at night. But the intermittency of wind is a particular issue, and the more you generate power using wind, the more you have this problem and you need backup. Furthermore, you cannot run an electricity grid without a base load of traditionally cheap power generation. In the past, oil in the very distant past used to supply that when oil prices were very low. Coal was also cheap, but of course polluting. And of course now we have nuclear power, and of course that can supply a good baseload at a cheap cost, as Tim Yeo suggested. The answer to security of supply, which is the problem is always there, it will never disappear, is that you have to have a different sources. And here, if I may introduce a concept which is well known in economics, and that's the concentration index, otherwise known as the Herfindahl-Hirschman index. Here, what you do is you take the sources of power generation, you form shares, 20% for gas, for example, 30% for renewables. You raise them to the power of 2, and then you sum. So this index goes from 0, of course, when you have only one source of energy to generate electricity, to 10,000. Looking at this index of concentration, we find that Greece, for example, has a number of 3,330 odd in the index, which is not bad, but it's still not secure enough. It doesn't help security because Greece, in the latest numbers I have for the 20th of the week ending the 20th of November, has 36% of its electricity was generated by gas, 43% by renewables in last week, and of course no nuclear. So that gives it quite a high rating in the concentration index. Remember, low numbers in the concentration index are good. They provide a lot of security. High numbers do not. In Europe, Poland has the highest rating, which is 5,600 odd units, and that's because it uses 73% of coal in generating electricity, and its renewables are at 15%. So it's best to have a nice spread of fuels that generate electricity. Japan, of all the countries, the developed countries certainly, but all around, has the lowest index, concentration index, because it has a spread of fuels used. It even had in 2021 oil at 3%, gas at 32%, coal at 30%, nuclear at 6%, only because of Fukushima. It would have been higher otherwise. Hydro at 8% and renewables at 13%. So that is the most balanced country, Japan. Europe as a whole, of course, has a low number at 2012, because, of course, when you add lots of countries together, they have different mixes of power generation, and, of course, you get a low number. You have to look at these matters on the concentration index on a country-by-country basis. China is 4,300 odd. India is 5,700 because it has coal at 74% of power generation. South Korea has around 2,800. Again, it's a nice spread with 26% nuclear. So the lesson from this is, if you want security of supply, you have to have a nice balance of fuels. And in Greece's case, the recommendation here is very clear, and Tim Yeo will be quite happy with this. Greece obviously needs nuclear power, both to spread the balancing, to balance the fuels, and also to provide baseload electricity. The fact that Greece doesn't have nuclear power is a detriment to its electricity generating system. Unfortunately, if I may conclude, from what I understand, Greece's revised renewable energy goal by 2030 provides for yet more renewables power generation, 28 gigawatts of new renewables power, and 7 gigawatts of storage, which of course you have to have some kind of storage if you want to have a huge amount of renewables. And this will require about 12 to 13 billion euros for the renewables, the power generation side, another 7 to 10 billion euros of storage. And of course, the grid itself, when you have that much electricity generated by wind and solar, you need to upgrade the grid and to invest in new transmission lines to bring renewable energy from the outlying areas and offshore, which they're planning to do. So the total investment is something like 35 billion. The problem with all this is that the intermittency of renewables, especially wind, cannot be avoided. So on that note, I'd like to mention a word of caution with these plans, and to bring us back to more balanced systems of power generation. And of course, this applies to gas, which is the transitional fuel. You need to have many different sources of gas, and the complete folly of Europe, especially Germany, relying on one source of natural gas for a lot of its energy requirements, shows up that problem. And balance is the word that one has to bear in mind for these matters.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, sir. I think that the word balance is a very good one. And I just want to elaborate a little bit on that from a regional point of view. You mentioned a lot of figures concerning both capacities and the financial side of development of these capacities, and the figures are really enormous, while at the same time, particularly in Southeastern Europe, the markets are relevantly small. And from this point of view, I think that the regional coordination and planning, when we consider new capacities in particular, particularly baseload capacities, is crucial. Of course, it's up to the Greek government to decide whether they will have in their energy mix nuclear or not. But first of all, this takes time. Second, it takes a lot of money. And third, as I said, we have to have a kind of a clarity about the not only the security of the supply, but also the security of demand. Because the construction of a lot of capacities at a certain moment might put us in a position when these capacities might not be competitive. So the planning and the balance, as you said, are really crucial. And the other thing which I wanted to say, provoked by what is said, with which I completely agree, we all kind of seem to share the same goals when it comes to development of the national energy sectors, but we have very different individual problems. We heard from the Albanian minister about 95% dependence on water, and at the same time, long period of drought, and then suddenly flood. So all these things are very different from country to country. Now we have with us the representative of the Prime Minister's office in Romania. This is Professor Purița. I just want to ask our learned colleagues who help us with the net, just to give us a signal when we have the possibility to include Dr. Fatuh from the Oxford Energy Institute. So, but please, Professor Purița, you have the floor now.
First, let me thank the organizer. Iene has done it again. Thank you. First, let me thank the organizer. Iene has done it again, a great conference with a very important topic. Second, it's always a pleasure to think a little about the evolution of the energy in terms of the complexity level that starts to be present these coming years. I was a member of the advisory group for energy of the European Commission and participated in 3 main strategies. The Commission has got several strategies of all sorts, but in energy, there is a strategy for climate change. Call it Green Deal, Fit for 55. It's a strategy related to reducing emissions. 0 emissions in 2030, 2050, depending on how you see it. There is a second strategy of energy strategy, energy security that demands diversification of portfolio, interconnection, and various other measures. This strategy was somehow neglected till now, and the signal of the evolution of the power market is actually a waking up signal on that. Third one is a strategy of innovation in energy, new technologies. They are talking about, let me put some extreme technologies, fusion, which in the last 60 years was 30 years ahead. They are talking about putting nuclear as a motor for spaceships that would get us faster to Mars. These are extremes. We have innovation in terms of clean coal technologies, carbon capture and storage and use. We have innovation in fuel cells, hydrogen-based generation of electricity, of electrical energy. We have various other electric vehicles. We have various other types of innovating technologies that are now penetrating on the market. You know, it's a logistic curve of penetration, like Marchetina Kicenovic in IASA demonstrated a long time ago. One of the things that I wanted to talk about, and let me use the Greek expression for it, of the world of today, it's anno kato, upside down. By contrast to the last 80 years of peace, almost 80 years since the Second World War, actually 3 generations almost, we have been educated and somehow conditioned to think the market is solving everything, let's use the market mechanism and so on, and we'll be all happy. What is happening today is that, and it took almost a year for the European Commission to come out of this educational blockage, and to us all actually, market can be used as it is designed in these last years power market can be used as an instrument against the economies. And this is what has happened. Starting last year's autumn, market prices were manipulated, increased, and economies were stricken by this thing and by this fact. And production was lost, enterprises were shut down, unemployment increased, and so on. Economies were weakened. We are actually, without defining it as such, in an economic war. It's very clear, and I started rereading The Art of War by Sun Tzu, who was saying somewhere that you don't need to make a military war. It's used only the fact that you disaggregate the economy of the enemy and you win the war without having to military act. It's very interesting that these things are somehow in the place of being happening today. And we have to wake up to it and start having a different type of approach and a different type of logic and action to what we call crisis. Let me say something else in terms of energy security. Talking about logic, actually, we are in Greece, we should talk about logic. It's philosophy. The idea is that up till now, on the climate change strategy, the Commission was pushing shut down coal. Coal is pollutant. Yeah. Yes, coal is pollutant. But the largest polluter in local situation is transportation. So on the same logic, we should stop transportation. How do you think an economy would work without transportation? No, we're not stopping coal, we're not stopping transport. We are stopping the use of pollutant technologies in transport and replace them with non-pollutant technologies, electric vehicles, hydrogen, and so on. We should stop using pollutant technologies in coal and replace them with non-pollutant technologies. As I told you, coal gasification, carbon capture, and so on. That brings us to the third strategy that I was talking about, to the strategy of innovation in energy. That is something that nowadays is very important, and the European Commission with this strategy started to think in terms of what the United States is doing for decades right now. Technologies, how to generate technologies, how to generate them for military, DARPA, for example, and then bring them to the peaceful use, how to generate them for space, NASA, and bring them to the society for use. And that is something that we should put an accent, a larger or a stronger accent on. We are in the position to look at the various technologies, and this is one thing that we should, I should send as a message. Evolution of power systems is not done based on what I call fashion-like collective efforts or collective effects. This year we wear red ties and make aeolian parks, wind parks. Next year we stop the coal and wear blue ties and so on. No, energy needs an integrated view. This is what the main message should be. Integrated view is actually what we need. It's not a question of playing every year on whatever the wind blows, okay? Not the physical wind, but the wind of ideas, of whatever, of fashion. So this is something that we should think about strongly and act upon trying to not to be blocked, to have a blocked head on the certain strict patterns of evolution of dynamics. Let me illustrate what I'm saying with a joke that says that, I will say it with Romania, but it applies to all Southeast Europe. It says the end of the world is coming. All countries disappear. Romania remains. You may replace with Greece. Why? Because we are 10 years behind. Or Bulgaria.
Of course.
The idea is that nobody is behind or advanced. We are all on our own trajectory of evolution. And we have to know where we are, where we want to go, and how to devise how to go there in an integrated way. The whole thing is that at this moment, we are somehow trying to wake up from a certain type of evolution that, as I told you, peace, starting 1945, what should I say, even the power crisis that we talked about later happened in 72, 73, so 50 years ago. 2 generations, 3 generations of peace. It's very clear that we need to get out of this blockage and start thinking in various type of action and interpretation of what we want to go, how we want to go there. I was a member of the study group for energy scenarios of the world, and I am a member of the World Energy Council, and we were preparing 2050, 2060, and actually, initially there were 2 scenarios. One was the market goes ahead and the state comes back and supports it. The other one was the state drives the direction and the market follows. Obviously, the first one could be United States, or the second one could be China, where the state says, I want 1,000 intelligent cities. And the market goes and builds 1,000 intelligent cities. The whole thing is that one thing in this evolution is a third scenario. We were naming the scenarios with musical. The first one with market goes ahead was jazz. The instruments are singing and they are creating music. The second one was symphony, where you have a conductor that is conducing the orchestra. We were joking that in the European Union we have 28 conductors and you have to synchronize the conductors first for the orchestra to make music. And the third scenarios, and I'm ending with this, was blues scenarios, where the situation is blue. It's not exactly a good situation, where energy fluxes were broken, changing, where the technologies were done locally and not on an integrated view and so on. Think about the logic behind our policies, and whenever somebody tells you, you should do whatever, try to get 2 steps back and enlarge your vision for an integrated view of the problem. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. I'll give you a few particular minutes afterwards to tell us more jokes, so think about them. But in between, let me just step on what you said about the integrated approach. I would add that it should be not only integrated, but it should be very much updated. If we look at what the Commission is doing in the last 6-7 months, it is communication after communication, draft law after draft law. I don't think that even the national authorities kind of managed to follow all these steps. Let me also recall that we were told what will happen in 2050, and we were not told what will happen this year. So it's a lot of necessity to update the approach on the ground of a common European symphony, if I may borrow borrow your words. The other issue which I wanted to mention is that about the role of the market, which you touched upon. Certainly the market economy is, without any doubt, one of the fundamentals of the developments of our society. But let me recall that when the Green Deal initiative was launched, the key message was that everything is being done in the benefit of the people. And at a certain moment, as you also correctly noted, it was the people who seemed to be mostly affected, and not only positively, from this thing. That is why we have to update the approach. I've mentioned this several times. I think that the European Union needs completely revised energy policy approach, and it has to follow the realities much more than it is doing this now. Now, we are now moving to our next speaker, and I hope we have a contact with him because it's online, Dr. Amit Moore. Yes. Hello.
Hello from Tel Aviv. Very summer-like here. Yesterday it was 30 Celsius degrees, today 25. So the endless summer is here as regularly, but also the effect of the climate change that we all feel in the world. I'd like to thank IENE, my friend Kostis Stambolis, for inviting me, and I really regret I am not with you in person. I would like to share 3 slides with you, and just a second, share it. I hope that you can see it. Can you see my shared slides?
No, Professor, we currently are looking at you, not at the slides.
So enable me the share screen, new share. Just enable me to share. If you can enable me to share.
Yeah.
Can you see right now?
We see something, but we don't see 3 slides. I see 8.
You see 8 slides.
I hope you have only 3.
I have, yes, I have the first 3 of them, but for some reason I'm not able to. Just a second.
Professor, if it doesn't work, please.
Can you see it?
Yes.
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 Okay.
Now, please.
So I'd like to sum up what was discussed. Dr. Vladimir Putin, not so many know that he holds a degree of PhD in energy and mineral economics and geopolitics. So he understands what he is doing, and basically he's pushing Europe and the world as a whole to this international energy crisis, and especially Europe, but many other nations, to stagnation and inflation. This is stagflation, deepening in Europe and elsewhere, developing countries and many of the world's economic slowdown. So what should we do? He provided us also in this crisis a unique opportunity to look at the mirror and say, basically summing up what was discussed, what should we do, and what in fact Europe is doing, and many other nations, Israel included. First, we have a crisis, we have shortage, so we are conservation, energy conservation, saving and efficiency. First we save. Europe is in the beginning of a very cold, expensive, and relatively dark winter. So saving, the first thing is saving. Secondly, of course, we try to diverse sources of natural gas, and Europe is doing to some degree of success. But it is we need to remember that relatively rich Europe enables or is succeeded in purchasing much of the free LNG in the spot market, especially from the United States, about 50 BCM per year, which is about 1/3 of the imports from Russia. It is becoming on the expenses of developing countries, China, India, Pakistan, and natural gas is not only fuel, it's also a major feedstock for production of fertilizers, and fertilizers means agriculture, and agriculture means food. So this is a nexus between energy and food, and the riches win in this respect on the expense of the weaker. So we have to remember that and the impact of that as well. So diversification of natural gas sources. Then Dr. Vladimir Putin, this butcher from Moscow, and the terrible tragedy in the war in the Ukraine, but he is causing a disaster, environmental disaster in the short run. Well, of course, shift to coal, the major increase in coal production in Europe, consumption in Europe and elsewhere. Of course, even cutting woods for heating illegally or legally in Europe, and utilization of oil for power generation, even heating and so on and so forth. But in the longer run, I would grant him the environmental price. He is Mr. Environment. He's pushing us in the world, Europe, to enhance the shift to renewables, to enhance the shift to smart transportation, especially EVs in the short run, and later on hydrogen-led fueled cars, and so on. So this crisis is also a locomotive for growth and a shift to a greener energy. And lastly, I would say it is, and was discussed a bit, it is a rethinking on the nuclear renaissance. I am a true believer in the nuclear renaissance for two reasons: environmental and energy security. So nuclear renaissance, we are not speaking on the short term, on the very long term. We take grassroots project 15 to 25 years. But basically this man, Dr. Vladimir, pushed us to think on that as well. Now I'd like to bring you a very strange but unique example of the state of Israel. So we were blessed with nice resources, reserves of natural gas, not a gas kingdom as many things or princehood, but we have gas for the next 30 years and also some nice reserves for export. So here it's not our latest, but we have already, this is the fuel of what you call a basket of fuel for power generation in Israel and Palestine included, because they receive their electricity, West Bank and Gaza from Israel. Until 2040, we have already forecast for 2050. And see, we due to the gas, in green, black is coal. About 10 years ago, it was 80% coal and 20% oil, heavy fuel and diesel. That were these were the fuels of power generation. With the introduction of gas, we are phasing out coal the fastest in the world. A world record in phasing out coal, and according to now, 70% gas, 20% coal, and 10% only renewables. And renewables in here, especially solar energy, because we don't have wind resources, we don't have hydro, we don't have geothermal. We only have solar energy, and it is very difficult, don't have time to discuss it. But 10% government resolution and 30% renewables and power generation by 2030, most likely will reach 25%. But what is important is a trend. By 2040, I believe will be in 40%. But if you see here this trend, this forecast, what I see even to 2050 is that by 2050 we're going to have very unique situation: 50% gas and 50% renewables, solar energy. Well, it's 30 years is not so long time. Maybe we'll have some minor nuclear, but I don't believe so, and so on. So here I'd like to speak on basically some truths that we believe they are. We are speaking on natural gas as a transit fuel. I determine natural gas will be with us to decades to come. In fact, much deep into the 22nd century. And why is that? Why do I claim that? Because what is the major objective? The major objective that most countries agree upon, not all, is net zero carbon emissions or greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And that's a major objective. And all the others that I mentioned, including renewables, are means to achieve this objective. So how can I say that? And it was mentioned, because of carbon capture, utilization, and storage. We have hundreds of projects already, and tens of new technologies. And even in the small country of Israel, we have 12 new startups which were developed only in the past 2 years. Fascinating carbon capture and utilization technologies, and we are working with 2 of them. Amazing technologies. So we need to think, and was discussed, that's the most important thing, the huge pace of technological developments. And this is happening in a pace that we were not, especially in infrastructure, familiar in the past. So with those technologies and with carbon capture, utilization, and storage developing, and I truly believe that it will capture, that basically, especially due to the financial model or tool of carbon taxation, which will push it. And Europe is going to be the leader in that, and most of the countries in the world will comply to avoid carbon border tax and so on and so forth. So I suggest to all of you to look at the there is a global organization of carbon capture and storage, CCS, and they publish annual reports, amazing. The technologies, the vast of projects, and so from the utilization of depleted oil and gas fields, underground aquifers, that's for storage, and so many utilization, the production of fertilizer, production of cement, and so on and so forth. So having that in mind, so those who think that we are going to basically phase out coal and gas altogether and jet fuel, that is kerosene, in airplanes or diesel in heavy duty transportation, so I think we'll continue. Of course, we need to do our best to curtail, to lower the utilization of fossil fuels, but it's all together. It's going to happen at the same time.
Okay, Professor, may I ask you to wrap up, please?
Yes, I'm finishing. That's it. So basically, with new technologies, with blue hydrogen and green hydrogen, and again, Germany, Europe, as a leader in the demand for that, the willingness to pay, and the idea of new technologies and major technological development, even technologies that we cannot think about it right now, will be with us. So the diversification of means, as discussed, is the key, and the key is technology. Well, thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. I just want to complement your statement, and in fact, one of your starting points, talking about the food issue in the context of the green transition, because we normally link the green transition in our minds mostly with energy, but it's not only about energy. Professor Puritsa already mentioned the transport, agriculture, and so on. It's about a completely new type of economic development. We must add digitalization and so on.
Let me give you 3 examples, 3 fast.
Very fast, please.
Very fast. First,
Microphone.
heresy.
Microphone, please.
Sorry. 3 fast ideas. First, a heresy. Don't burn me in Piazza dei Fiori in Rome like Giordano Bruno. European Union has got 2 big problems. They need gas to heat during winter, and they want to diminish emissions, not to let the temperatures increase. Climate change. How about increasing emissions, the temperature increases, and we don't need gas to heat?
Okay. Okay.
It's now, based on present policy, a heresy. Only the idea is that the cost of such an action are much offsetting the benefits. Italy may become a desert, and Lapland would become a wine producer. Both unacceptable. Obviously, the second one is electric vehicles, because we were talking transportation. I made a very simple calculation. I said, okay, it's an energy conservation. Looked on Eurostat and found out how much gasoline and diesel transportation vehicles in European Union are consuming. If you replace that with electric vehicles, you have to load the batteries with the same amount of energy. Not talking efficient and so on. Try to make the calculation in order to cover up and to switch all transportation in Europe from now to electric vehicles in extra power generation. And finally, consumption. I was a project officer in Albania on energy transport project relaunching back in '99, and the colleague in the World Bank was doing a public lighting project of Albania. $100 million on efficient light bulbs, switchers, light night automatically, and so on. I was telling him, hey, look, when you do a project, you want to know why you do that project. What is the basic need that that project is covering? And the basic need is that we don't see in the dark. Albanian population is about 2 million persons. If you buy at $50 a piece 2 million infrared goggles for every person, they will see in the dark. So you don't need lighting in public, in buildings, and so on. The question is, the technology is there. Our military people can tell us that they have the infrared goggles. It's only a question of mass production. But do we accept the value to change the values of our living? And that is another big question. I'm not going to get into those details. Thank you.
Well, now, in fact, we started with Albania, and we are benefiting from having Professor Dimo with us, who is energy and risk analyst. So, Professor, what are the risks, the current risks? How do you see them?
We have discussed.
Please.
I have a presentation.
Yes, please do.
Okay. So, thank you. And after this very interesting presentation, but which cover the regional, European, and global energy issues regarding the energy security, energy supply, climate change, and everything, I will focus only in an example in Albania, what we are facing for the energy security supply of the country. And in my discussion, I will focus in three main issues, which is the current situation of the energy supply, energy security supply in the country, which is the need for diversification of energy sources, and finally, which is the, the force of the Albanian government, Albanian institution for to use this geopolitical situation, new geopolitical developments as regard the energy security supply. So, after the presentation of the Minister Baluku, we will focus only on some small figures. So, to discuss something, we have here a picture regarding the primary energy production in the country, which is something around 1,500 kiloton oil equivalent. The same is the quantity of the imports of energy products. We have a consumption of around 2,000 kiloton oil equivalent, but in the meantime, we have the export energy products of 822 kiloton oil equivalent. What happened in this situation? It depends, here is the graph, it depends by the energy structure in our country. We have the electricity production based mainly in the hydro. Maybe we can say 99% is produced by hydro. We have a local production of the crude oil, But we have not in place now modern refineries to have byproducts with high quality, with European standards. For that reason, we have the obligation to export something like 80% of the crude oil production. And in the meantime, we are obliged to import something like 90% of oil, of all oil consumed in our country. For that reason, we have this disbalance between the production, energy production, and the energy consumption and the exports in the meantime. But using the new development as regard the oil terminals in Albania, we use this possibility to re-export certain quantities of the oil byproducts to the neighbor countries, mainly in Kosovo, which balance, how to say, the import-export of the energy products. But this is the graph that shows which are the quantities of gas oil and liquefied petroleum gas imports and re-exports to the neighbor countries. But the situation, as the minister present and is clear, is totally depend by the weather condition, by the rainfalls. So on the years that we have a low quantity of rainfalls in our country, we have a low production. But in the years that we have a lot of rainfalls, we have a high energy production in our country. And in this time, we are forced to export certain quantities. And in these graphs, we show that in the years that the local production of electricity is low, we have high imports. And in the years that we have high production of electricity, generation of electricity in our country, we have high exports as well. So, but in any times, we cover average up to 70% of the needs for electricity consumption. So this is the reason that we conclude that we have need for a diversification of energy sources. And this is except the considering as well the climate change that yes, all the previous speakers say something that we not expect, how to say, a good situation as regard to the weather in the region and in Albania as well. And so we have foreseen that the rainfalls will decrease year after year. For that reason, we have need for new sources. One of the most important sources are the using of natural gas generally, and especially the liquefied, the LNG, the liquid natural gas. So, not to set more on this direction, because something is treated during the minister's speech in this conference, but it's important to underline something that Albania has also projects and now is under the construction. The first big photovoltaic park in the Karavasta region with a capacity up to 140 megawatt, and the second one is under the discussion of the contract. But we have as well a bid, organized a bid for the wind farms for the capacities up to from 100 to 140 megawatt. An important measure that the Albanian government has taken to increase, how to say, the contribute of the renewables and to support the households in this situation of energy crisis is the finance of the installation for the solar power for the heating water. It is important that the government with how to say support 70% of the cost of this installation, and there is a target of the government to have in place on March 2023 up to 10,000 of solar panels. Important is to say something regarding the how to say the new exploration. because as is discussed in the previous presentation, it's important to say that yes, we will focus to renewables, but in the case that we will have in place more oil and more natural gas, it would be good for the energy, like in the energy security, like in the case of our country. So we have new discovery in the center of Albania, in the structure, carbonate structure, which is called Spirago structure, and the Dutch company Shell is developing this, and we hope that within next two or 3 years to put in operation this very important oil and gas field. But energy security has need to have how to say wider interconnection with the neighbor countries and in the region. So we have in place now electricity interconnection with high voltage with the neighbor countries, Montenegro, Kosovo, Greece, and is under construction the new high voltage electricity line with the North Macedonia. But in the meantime, we accept the development of the gas sector in the country that we mentioned before. We have in place some important gas project that connection Albania with the other countries in the region. And I would like to underline something which is important, that yes, we have this, how to say, Eastern Balkan flows, Balkan stream from Greece to Bulgaria to Romania and north, but it would be important to have another stream, the Western stream, which will start from Greece as well, Albania, Montenegro, Croatia, towards Slovenia and Austria. This is very important. It would be possible to have such, how to say, a wider southern gas corridor, where except the TAP and TANAP, or existing southern gas corridor, to include in this wider southern gas corridor, to include as well the East Med. Finally, in actual situation, the Albanian government, the Albanian institution has playing an important role towards the regional cooperation, towards the, how to say, the regional projects for the energy security, for the energy supply. One of the most important that we have mentioned is the possibility to increase the investment in the gas sector through the cooperation with Azeri companies. The president of Azerbaijan has been last week in Albania and decide, how to say, in principle, for new investments, Azeri investments in Albania for the gas sector and for the established for the building of new ultra-modern refinery for the oil byproducts. And we are here in Greece. Of high importance are the relation between the Albanian companies, Albanian institutions, and all the energy producers between two countries. So we have heard by the Minister Balbougou and the Greek Minister of Energy, which is the situation, but this is very important to have such kind of cooperation in the interest of the countries, and finally for the, how to say, to increase the security of supply for energy for both countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you. No, please. I myself have been communicating with the Albanian authorities for quite a lot of years, and it's really very exciting towards the developments which you're having, because your case is really very, very specific from many perspectives. I just wanted to say one word on what you mentioned about this idea for kind of a new gas pipeline project. I think that it's not an advice to your authorities, please don't misunderstand me, but I think that from nowadays perspective, the reassessment of any kind of such international projects should be done very carefully, because the technologies are really moving very, very fast forward. while constructing such kind of projects takes a lot of time. This is, by the way, one of our considerations in my country, for example, when we are talking even about new nuclear power plant, which is on the table for almost 50 years and which now looks from a lot of perspectives to be inadequate, simply because of the boom of the new technologies, including the small nuclear modular reactors, which you mentioned, which your minister referred to. So I'm looking for the last, whether we have communication with Oxford? No? Oh. Yeah, well, I propose that we start a discussion, and if we succeed, then we shall come back. Now, you heard a lot of different opinions, people presenting views which you might share or which you might criticize. Now it's your turn to say what you think, which are the key energy dilemmas in global, European, and regional and national perspective. I propose that we have an agreement that we talk under the Chatham House rules, so you feel free to say whatever you wish, and we keep the discussion here. Please feel free to criticize us, to disagree, and all that. The professor will answer with a joke. Anybody who wants to take the floor, please. Can you please just introduce yourselves?
I have a question.
Yes, please. Yes.
Thanks. I have a question, if possible, to the IEA representative, or Apostolos is not here. Yeah.
Please join us.
Danilo Bachkaryov, Stimson Center in Brussels. It's actually a question to Apostolos regarding the WEO. I mean, let's say one question relates to Turkmenistan, one question relates to Russia. Try to be brief. I mean, they're a bit technical, but I mean, they're quite interesting. I mean, first, let's start with Russia. Basically, I saw your assessment, and just a question on which flows these assessments are based. I mean, do you assume zero flows to the EU? Do you assume power of Siberia 2 working? What's the assumption of Sakhalin flows, LNG, and the pipeline to China? I mean, that's the first question. And second, which is more interesting to me personally, it's regarding Turkmenistan. You didn't mention it, but you have it in your outlook. And I was a bit surprised, taking account with country. I mean, like, sometimes some people think their reserves are a bit overrated, but still they're quite impressive. You have very modest outlook, even on the maximum around 150 BCM of production per year by 2050. And on a like normal scenario, like you have around 100. I mean, what's the assumption where it's mostly like China and internal petrochemicals, it's TAPI pipeline, it's Trans-Caspian, it's Kazakhstan and Russia, I mean, and what are the percentages of the flow? Thanks.
Please.
Okay, thank you for the question. It's really technical, and it's really on the gas supply oriented question. So all the assumptions are available there in the book there, and please feel free to come back to me with additional questions, and I will link you with the colleagues that they are working specifically on this aspect. And it's on chapter 8 of the World Energy Outlook, most of the assumptions and what we see as a future in terms of how supply of gas is going to move in the future. For example, as I saw you before in my presentation, you see a shift from pipeline, especially due to what is happening in Russia, to a big increase on LNG. But like, I see everyone's worries about the situation on gas markets. Another point I would like to add on your question is specifically for Europe. I mean, it's really hard to replace Russian gas imports there. For this reason, as an agency, we point out continuously, and we are trying to raise the attention that you need to have and to apply demand measures. Like to cut the gas demand, especially for the next winter. We have specifically an analysis on that, and we see that there is a gap of 30 BCM in order to be able to fulfill and to refill again the storage facilities. So as an agency, we are working closely with European Commission, and we we're planning to come back with concrete actions in the coming month in order to see how we can reduce this demand. Specifically, we need to push further renewables, energy efficiency, heat pumps in buildings, and also some behavioral measures in order to cut this demand and to be able to have and to ensure that the supply will be there to fill our demand needs for the next winter. Thank you.
Well, just please keep the microphone because I want to complicate your life now a little bit, jumping on the question which was asked about the relations with Russia. Just to get your professional view on that, let me just recall that till 2011, there were fabulous relations between the EU and Russia. There was a so-called EU-Russia Energy Council, which was not only on state level, but it was also on business level. And the communication was moving, although there were disagreements and so on. Then this suddenly started to fade away, and now the war is has changed completely everything. The problem is that from pragmatic point of view, the LNG option, which everybody looks at to the extent it's possible, to the extent there is an access for such kind of an option, at the current level cannot compensate the pipeline gas on the one side. On the other side, we have now a new situation, new legal situation, which is since a couple of weeks, when there was an arbitration procedure ended between Russia and Finland. And it is linked to the fact that the Finnish authorities, via their company Gazprom, refused to pay under the decree which Mr. Putin issued, I think it was in April. And it was announced that the arbitrage has been in favor of Gazprom. The decision is not public yet, or at least I haven't seen it. But we in Bulgaria are now expecting same situation with this. And in the Finnish case, it's about 300 million euros. In our case, our estimates is that it will be about 1 billion euros. So what is on the ground of your assessment and your knowledge about the trends, what is your assessment, in which direction will these relations go on further when it comes to gas particularly?
Yeah.
Because let me recall, it's not only gas when we talk about the relations with Russia. We have also the nuclear fuel, although under the European energy statistics, nuclear fuel is considered domestic source. We have also coal exports and so on. So what is your principal assessment as a trend?
Yeah. It's key to mention that, first of all, Russia was the top largest fossil fuels exporter, and we have also nickel, apart from what you mentioned, that it's going to be used also in batteries. Of course, what we see that it's, as I said before, it's not possible only from LNG. To fill the gap. And it's really needed, especially for the next winter, to have some demand measures. Even if you have an additional LNG capacities, like if China is going to recover back to 2021 levels, it's going to eat most of the additional LNG capacity. This winter you will not have any more Russian gas in the level that it has been we imported last year, so it's quite challenging, the situation there. And of course, it takes time. Even if we have seen quite big development on LNG projects, we heard before from previous speakers there, it takes time to increase the capacity. Also, you are in an open market there, so it depends really what China is going to happen in order to secure that the LNG cargo it's coming and imported in Europe. What it's hard is to just from a geopolitical perspective to see if this is going to continue. We haven't assessed, for example, a scenario that we return back to previous levels. We are not in a. We think that Russia lost its trust in the market, and this linkage between Europe and Russia it has been broken, and we don't foresee that to recover soon on previous levels. But what is key, and I wanted to touch base also on the discussion before, of course there are implications there. there are barriers in order to have renewables in the market. We know that wind does not blow all the time. We know that we know that sun, it's not all the time there in the evening, for example. But the only way in order to move forward and to ensure that we have the security that we are talking about, we need to invest on clean energy technologies. It's not possible to want to have a stable market and to rely 80% on fossil fuels and then to say that it's because of energy transition that we have high prices. Right. It's a little bit, it's not a logical, we talked about logic before, it's not like a reasonable statement, that one.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, the good news is that we have already communication with Dr. Fatou. So he will, in fact, as I mentioned to you in advance, his key topic is related to the Russia-Ukrainian war and its impetus on the energy situation. So, Dr. Fatou, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you. Can you hear me? And
oh, yes. Hello, very nice having you with us.
To connect, so
sorry for these technicalities.
No, absolutely. I'm very glad that I was able to join. So first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm delighted to be joining. And I really hope that you can see my slides. So I thought that I will give an overview on some of the key implications of the energy crisis, because you know, to me, you know, the Russian invasion of Ukraine really represents a paradigm shift for global and European energy markets and energy relations in particular. And there's a very widespread belief that there is no return to the previous order, and that markets are searching for a new normal. But at the same time, the transition to this new normal can be long and bumpy. And of course, there are many implications, but given the limited time that I have, I would like to focus on 4 implications. The first one is related to the energy policy and the trilemma. The second one is to the role of the state versus the market in energy generally. And then I'm going to go into a little bit details on the transformation, both that we are seeing in oil and gas trade flows. And finally, I will make a few observations on global cooperation on the climate agenda in a very challenging environment. So hopefully I will be able to do all of this in the next 10 to 12 minutes. So let me start with the first one, the energy policy and the trilemma. You know, as you know, energy policy is really multifaceted. It's about sustainability, it's about security, it's about affordability, it's also about development, it's also about economic competitiveness. And I think that the benign environment, particularly in Europe, lowered the importance of energy security and affordability. When I talk about benign environment, I mean high growth rates, low interest rates, low inflation, abundance of energy, and relatively cheap energy. But of course, the Russian-Ukraine war has changed all of this. And what we have seen is that security and affordability have become the key factors currently shaping energy policy. And of course, this is creating a lot of trade-offs and unintended consequences, at least in the short term. For instance, we're seeing interfuel substitutions from gas to coal or gas to oil, and this is increasing emissions. And we're also seeing some support measures by the government, which are diluting the impact of price signals and impacting consumers' behavior. And here I would like also to emphasize one aspect is the interconnectedness of energy markets has much wider global implications. So it's not really enough to look at what's happening in Europe, but to broaden that perspective, because by Europe competing in energy markets, particularly on gas and coal, it's making energy much more expensive in many developing countries. And this is affecting affordability, and it's going to also impact their transition paths as well. So that's why the transition is not likely to proceed linearly and uniform across the globe. It could be subject to some setbacks in some countries, but it also can trigger an accelerated transition, for instance, in some places like Europe. So this is the first observation. The energy trilemma is much more in focus. I think the second implication has to do with the role of the state versus the market. Because what we are seeing as a result of the energy crisis is that the governments are taking measures to offset the impact of shocks on the consumers and the industry. And those are coming in different types of forms. For instance, we are seeing support packages to protect consumers, and this is dampening the impact of price signals. We're seeing windfall taxes and levies being imposed in order to finance these support packages. Some countries are imposing price caps or thinking of imposing caps to shield consumers from the energy price shocks. And there have been even calls for redesigning electricity and carbon markets. And to me, really, some of these measures are increasing policy risk and uncertainty facing investors. And in a way, this will impact investment decision and could even impact the pace of the transition in some countries. But I think more fundamentally, this raises the question of the state versus the market. Market forces are a central part of the energy system, but government is really ultimately responsible for guaranteeing that everyone has access to energy, also for securing the public goods of decarbonization and security of supply, and also very, very importantly as well, demonstrating that energy markets work for all citizens. So how to balance the role of government versus market in future market designs, I think this is going to be a central question. And what I see at the moment is the current crisis is causing swing away from markets towards states. And the question is, how long will this continue? And I think one also needs to ask this question when there is the admission that net zero targets are being missed. Are we going to basically see even further government intervention? So I think this issue of the state versus the market is going to become more important as we look forward. So the third aspect that I would like to talk about is what we are seeing in terms of transformations in oil and gas trade flows. Because as a result of the Russia-Ukraine war, we have seen massive transformation in both of these energies. So far, what we have seen in the oil side is that the Russian oil supply disruption has been limited so far, and certainly well below the initial expectations at the start of the Russian-Ukraine war, which at the moment we are estimating around the disruption or supply losses of around 400,000 barrels per day, which is quite small, especially when you compare it to the initial projections. And the reason why we haven't seen big disruption is the fact that Russia succeeded in redirecting crude exports away from Europe to other parts of the world, and particularly to Asia. And they have been doing this through offering discounts and easier payment conditions. And so far, the services and logistics, for instance, in terms of shipping and insurance, have not acted as a constraint so far. But this might change as the EU embargo comes in force into December. And I will talk a little bit more about this later on. So if you look basically at the crude exports from Russia, they are above the pre-war levels of around 200,000 barrels per day. It really depends on how you measure that. But so far, we haven't seen crude exports fall below the pre-war levels when it comes to crude. Where we have seen some fall in export is on the product side, because as you know, Russia is also an important exporter of products, particularly diesel, VGO, and fuel oil. And that's basically where we have seen the decline. And what is this basically forcing European buyers to go to further away places to secure their products, all the way from Asia to Europe, to the Middle East, and to the US. And this is going to be quite important because the EU product markets remain quite tight, particularly basically when it comes to middle distillates. They are well below the 5-year average. And what we're seeing is the margins are usually at a quite elevated level in Europe. So as the embargo starts coming into effect, we're likely to see the products market basically tightening further. So the question really that is engulfing the market at the moment is that whether the EU embargo, which will come into effect in December, will we witness a more severe supply disruption from Russia? Russia has to reroute more crude from west to east, and this can put actually strains on the logistics. Finding insurance coverage outside the EU and the G7 is quite challenging. Also, it's quite important to remember that the Russian exports to Asia are currently concentrated in 2 countries. Basically, Russia has lost most of its customers in Asia. So most of their exports are going to China and India. So the question really, how much additional crude are these countries willing to take? And also we don't know how will Russia respond and will it respond by cutting production to the price caps. So what we are estimating at the moment is a loss of around 900,000 barrels per day towards the end of the year. And next year in 2023, we are projecting around a loss of 1.25 million barrels per day compared to the pre-war levels. So there's likely to see some supply losses bigger than what we have seen so far. The other impact that we are also seeing is on terms of European gas supplies. We have seen sharp decline in Russian pipeline flows to Europe in 2022. And in a way, the pipeline flows have been at maximum capacity. So if you look at the pipeline flows from Norway to EU have been at full capacity. There's a new Baltic pipe to Poland via Denmark, and this will divert some Norwegian flows away from Germany. But actually, Poland was importing pipeline gas from Germany. So in a way, there is really no net loss in Norwegian supply. But the general picture remains the same. If you look at Algeria's domestic gas balances are basically left smaller volumes available for export in 2022 compared to 2021, and a smaller pipeline export and LNG export from Algeria to the EU, as can be seen from this graph. Also, the pipeline flows from Azerbaijan via the Trans-Adriatic pipeline basically remains at full capacity. And when you look at the Russian gas supplies to Europe, and particularly, these are unlikely to increase. And one would argue that basically the downside risk is much higher, particularly regarding the transit via Ukraine, because as you know, Gazprom holds a transit contract with Naftogaz, which is pursuing commercial arbitration against Gazprom. And Gazprom is basically threatening Naftogaz with Russian sanctions. And this, in a way, could cause transit for Russian gas via Ukraine to halt. So basically, if you look into the rest of this year and into 2023, there is really very little scope for additional pipeline supply coming from Russia or outside Russia in 2023. What we have also seen is a massive transformation in LNG imports. LNG exports, particularly from the US, have grown substantially from 1.5 BCM in 2016 to 93 BCM in 2021. And so far, year to date, and here I'm referring to January to October, LNG exports from the US have grown from 77.8 BCM to 87 BCM between 2021 to 2022. And what is attracting a lot of these LNG is actually the high European gas prices. And that's why I'm saying many of the developing countries, emerging countries, are actually being squeezed out from the LNG markets. And Europe is benefiting from growth in US LNG exports and the plenty of US LNG, which is off-taken by portfolio players with the spot sales optionality. If you look at the Qatar's European imports from Qatar in 2002, likely to be higher than in 2021, but it's quite important to note that they are still lower than pre-COVID 2019. Of course, we're here assuming that if November, December volumes are the same as October. But as Europe has been attracting more LNG, what we are seeing is that a dramatic year-on-year decline in Asian imports, particularly in Chinese LNG imports. And that is what has allowed the Europeans to attract a lot of this LNG. And of course, in China in particular, this is driven by economic slowdown, by their zero-COVID policy. And LNG, in a way, in China is the marginal gas supply behind domestic production and pipeline imports from Central Asia and Russia. But generally, if you look at the combined LNG imports into India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, basically these have declined. And big part of that has to do with the fact that gas prices and LNG prices are much higher. So when people talk about this as a one-year crisis, I think this is really oversimplistic. We're talking about a multi-year crisis. So European storage stocks are quite elevated, even if you compare them basically with record of 1st of November 2021 at around 99 BCM. And there's this very strong political push to get gas into storage into the summer of 2022. But really the fears was going to start basically playing out in 2022 and 2023. So looking ahead, the volume of gas left in European storage at the end of the winter is going to be a key issue. And that is going to determine how much Europe needs to inject in the summer of 2023 and how high stock levels will be on November 1, 2023. But it's quite important that the context has changed. There is less Russian pipeline supplies than previously. And whether Europe is going to be able to repeat what they've done in 2022 depends very much what happens in Asian demand and particularly what happens in LNG demand from China. So we have been seeing massive transformation in trade flows, both on the oil front and the gas front. So let me now just conclude with a few observations on the global cooperations on climate change, because I think this is quite an important issue as well, because the Russian-Ukraine war is affecting the background of climate change diplomacy, because now we are living in a much polarized world, which could impact collaboration on climate policy. Energy security and affordability are taking center stage in most countries. There's a very strong drive to limit dependency of foreign energy sources of both energy and minerals. There's also very strong drive towards relocation and localization of supply chains, and this is going to impact very much the cost of the transition and also the cost of the supply chains. And also we're operating in an environment when most countries are facing fiscal constraints and heavy debt burdens. And it's very important, just to conclude with one observation, is that the developing countries' tension on climate finance are continue to rise. This has to do with the fact that, the developing countries are looking for finance in terms of mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. And that's why people might be disappointed from the outcomes of COP27. But I think the agreement in loss and damage was extremely important, as a step forward and actually as a building confidence measure to look forward to the other COPs and more generally to climate change diplomacy. So those are few observations. There are many other implications, but I thought, given the time limited, I focus my discussion and my remarks on those 4 key implications. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fatouh. It was extremely informative. And I'm also very grateful to our team, which succeeded to establish the connection with you. Finally, I myself have a couple of observations and questions to you, but firstly, I would like to ask the audience, because they were so patient, waiting together with me, of course, for your intervention. So, is there any reaction? Yes, please. Yeah, please, microphone. And I don't know whether Dr. Fatouh sees you, so just please again mention
thanks.
your name.
I can only see the panel. Apologies.
All right.
Thanks, Daniel Bochkaryov, Stimson Center, Brussels. I have a couple of questions for Bassam. First, it's regarding LNG. What's your take on what's happening in the future of LNG in Pakistan, taking account of this contract cancellation due to the high prices in Europe? I mean, that's the first part of the first question. And what's your view on what's going to happen in the U.S. LNG production? Because we see what's the U.S. upstream and LNG were quite careful if you compare what has happened in the last 10 years. There was some growth, but the focus now, at least my impression, is on the dividends, financial results, than on the really fast development. Do you see it's gonna keep going like this, or we will go back to the previous model? And the last question, very short one, was Mr. Nakov was mentioning regarding the energy crisis, saying what's the current geopolitical events, basically were not to trigger, but something we just facilitated. Do you see the same thing happening with the change in energy flows? What it was something what was objective and was just pushed pushed a bit more by current events, or you see, basically geopolitics playing a crucial role in this change of trade flows? Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions to Dr. Fatouh? So we just put everything on his plate. from the audience? If not, one question from my side, Dr. Fituh. I was very impressed by what you said regarding the risks of the measures taken by the governments in this situation. Can you please elaborate a little bit more on that, in the sense, which are kind of the key risks? And let me tell you why I'm asking you, because particularly within the European Union, under the Treaty for the Functioning of the European Union, the energy policy falls within the so-called shared policies, which means in legal terms that the EU guidance has a leading role and the governments follow. That is, when we talk about the risks which the governments face, we should also recall what the EU provides as legal framework, as communication, as guidance, and so on. So can you please just comment on that as well? Thank you.
Sure. There are a lot of excellent questions there. So and I realize, in terms of the timing. So I'll try to be brief. So I think the first point is related, if I hear correctly, is basically to Pakistan. Perhaps that what I've heard, but I think the more general point, and I think I raised that during my presentation, is that, when we look at the impact of the shock, it's very important to emphasize that energy markets are extremely interdependent. And what happens in one part of the world is actually impacting other parts of the world. As I mentioned, by Europe basically trying to attract gas and turning from the last resort market to first resort, basically, buying buying gas, LNG, coal. It's making the affordability issues much worse in other parts of the world, particularly in countries, for instance, such as Pakistan, but more generally in Asia. And to me, this is going to actually make it much more challenging for many of those countries, because they are not only facing an energy crisis, they are also facing a food crisis, but also they are facing a financing crisis, because many of those countries are finding it extremely difficult to raise finance in international markets in order to fund all of these mitigation and adaptation projects. And that is why in the COP27, there was a lot of emphasis not only on the availability of finance, but also the cost of finance as well, where many countries were saying, look, in the West, you have a lot of financial markets, developed financial markets, and you can access financial markets at relatively cheap cost. But actually, many of the developing countries and emerging countries cannot do that, especially as political risk and currency risk start increasing. So that's one observation. The second observation, I think it has to do with the U.S. shale. I think we have seen a significant change in the U.S. shale behavior, both on the oil and gas front, because basically those companies do both oil and gas. First of all, they're facing inflationary bottlenecks. They are facing other types of constraints as well. So their ability to ramp up production is being impacted. Particularly, we're seeing that very clearly on the oil side. But also, one needs to emphasize as well that the ESG is also impacting investment. And also, what we are finding is that many of those companies, we have seen a fundamental change in their behavior, in that they are returning they're returning basically money back to the shareholders or paying off debt. So there are plenty basically of issues which is going to basically make new LNG projects, because all of these LNG projects that came and in a way were very useful to Europe, basically those were investment made many years back, and it will basically happen quite conveniently. I think a couple of things happened quite conveniently, is that a lot of these projects basically came during this time, and China's demand for LNG basically has fallen quite dramatically. And I think one final point is on the risks of government intervention. And I personally think that we are seeing more government intervention, certainly, and we're likely to see more government intervention. and that is going to basically come in different shapes. And to me, this is certainly going to have an impact on the investment decisions, both in conventional fuels, but also in renewable projects. But I think it's also going to impact the investment environment overall. And that's why, to me, one should be very, very careful with those types of government interventions, because it is very well recognized that you need to address the affordability issue, but at the same time, you shouldn't lose sight of the longer-term objectives of ensuring that that you are able to accelerate the energy transition within Europe. How this is going to happen, I really don't. We are observing like anyone else, but some of the suggestions or some of the propositions, we worry very much, particularly when you're talking about price caps in wholesale gas markets and all of those, some of those ideas, that actually worries us a lot, because that can result in the destroying of the markets. But also, not passing the price signal to consumer as well is also another important aspect. And I think what is missing in the debate, and we have been discussing a lot of this in the Institute, is what's happening on the demand side. A lot of people are focusing on the supply side, but there isn't enough attention on what's happening on the demand side. And I don't think this is only related to what we are seeing today, but more generally, when we talk about the energy transition, we don't pay much attention to consumer behaviors and whether those are changing fast enough to result in an accelerated energy transition. So I hope those answered some of your questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fatouh. I just want to recall on what you said, that there is a clarity about the trend concerning the future, but how it will work in real terms is something which we'll see. Professor Purița used a Greek word, and I shall use an Arab expression, inshallah, in this context, because it's a lot of changes which are ongoing. And besides, there is one key factor which I don't think that a lot of people believed will work in the way it did, is the technological boom. It is moving so fast, so quickly forward, and it definitely influences very much the market. Well, with these words, because we're a little bit over schedule, although we also started late, I want to first of all thank all of you for being here. Thank our panelists, those who are physically here and those who are online, for being such professionals and for sharing with us their views. And once again, thank Kostis Stambolis and his team for the excellent job and for bringing us together again. And we are looking forward towards more meetings of this type. I think that the availability of such kind of audience and so knowledgeable people indicates that we need to talk more. Thank you very much once again.
Thank you.